Welcome back to MattTalksMedia. I'm Matt, and this is the show where we dig into underground music, indie horror, alternative art, and the research that connects it all. In episode 1, we asked the big question, what is alternative media? Today, we're zeroing in on one of my favorite examples from the underground music world, DIY recording. So, DIY stands for do it yourself, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I have a feeling that the term DIY is going to be a tongue twister for me about halfway through this episode because we're going to be mentioning it a lot. So, DIY recording isn't just about sound. It's about independence, identity, and resistance. But sometimes it's really just about being poor. Poverty is absolutely a factor in media producing, how we understand the world and ourselves. So, it's all rather relevant, right? Our ability to fund the projects that we want to do. And if we can't fund them, but we still want to do them, how do we manage that? So in this episode, we're going to explore DIY recording, what that really means, how it shaped musical genres such as punk, hardcore, and black metal and beyond, why roughness and imperfection became aesthetic choices, and how it connects to the broader world of alternative media. So in our first part, we're going to talk about what do we really mean by DIY recording. So DIY recording can be more than just saving money. It's an alternative media practice. In my own research, I talk about alternative media as media created outside traditional institutions, often with limited resources, but carrying cultural or political weight. A cassette recorded in a bedroom isn't just a demo, it's a statement of independence. So what are some of these recording practices that maybe fall under this DIY umbrella? So you have 4-track cassette recorders democratizing music all the way back in the 1980s and 1990s. Suddenly, kids in garages could layer drums, bass, guitar, and vocals without access to a pro studio. Some bands even worked with boom boxes and karaoke machines, bouncing tracks back and forth until the sound was degraded but uniquely theirs. Musicians improvised using guitar amps for vocals, recording in bathrooms to capture natural reverb, or propping mics in closets for isolation. So some examples and lore of these practices, I should say. Guided by voices. Robert Pollard's basement recordings embraced tape hiss as a part of the art, so that noisy hissing sound you get when you use a tape recorder. His amateurism, quote unquote, became a mark of authenticity. In metal, drummers sometimes used practice pads or half kits to avoid neighbors complaining about how loud it is to be a drummer, later overdubbing the cymbals. So how does this connect to my research? I think this connects to journalistic doxa that we mentioned in episode 1, that set of professional norms and assumptions that define good, quote unquote, media. Mainstream recording values polish, clarity, and perfection. DIY rejects that doxa. It says imperfection is authenticity. So in my own experience, DIY focused a lot on the ethos behind what we were doing. So yes, DIY methods are more cost effective for those who don't have a lot of money. Even home recording equipment is much cheaper than going to Guitar Center and buying all the fancy bells and whistles or paying a professional to record your music. But there's a pride in DIY that can be found in the way that artists describe the process or even how they advertise their music to the world. In the underground music scenes, there's always been the saying DIY or die. It's a big slogan in the underground metal and punk scenes, and that has become, part of the identity, part of the ethos of underground music. So for many of my early band appearances, we couldn't afford to book time at a huge fancy music studio. We had to adjust, and we had to use the tools at our disposal to get our music out there to the world. Did it sometimes lead to a less than perfect product? Almost every single time. So absolutely. But in the world of music, having some product is better than no product. So if you're trying to get on a show, a lot of the times promoters want to be able to hear your music. So even if it's a cheaply recorded demo, that's better than not having anything at all. I have recorded in what we would consider an official studio twice. Once with my band, The Great He-Goat, which was named after a Goya painting. We recorded an entire album in Joplin, Missouri over a weekend. It was a very hectic weekend, but it was super fun and wouldn't change a thing about it. We did record a demo in a home studio with the band Death Inquisition. That was the thrash metal band that I was in. To my knowledge, it was a professionally built studio. It was at a gentleman's home. I don't remember the name of the studio or this guy's qualifications. It sounded okay. So, I guess I have 3 experiences being in a professional studio. Lung Butter recorded our demo in a studio in Tulsa. So I have 3 experiences being in, I guess, what you would consider an official studio. But I also have quite a bit of experience recording things at home, doing things in a DIY way. I want to give a quick shout out to my good friend Ethan Stenson. He played guitar in Abyssal Rites. He's got several of his own projects like Magazu and Cranionaut. So if you're looking for good music coming out of the Norman, Oklahoma area, check his music out. You can find them on Bandcamp. He took over recording duties for our musical endeavors. Ever since that happened, our music sounded a million times better than it ever had before. We didn't even need to go to a professional studio because of Ethan's talent and his ear as a recording artist. So, before we dive into our next section, I want to take a quick music break. Just like we did on our last episode, I love to feature bands that I find on Bandcamp. So make sure, as you're listening, if you enjoy a track, if you enjoy a band, check them out, support the artist, buy their music, even if it's free for download, send them some money. So this one is a mouthful, so bear with me. The track is titled Mankind as a Concept of Self-Failure and a Constant Cycle of Reaffirmed Suffering by the Brazilian band Silent Oblivion. Enjoy. All right, and we're back. That was Silent Oblivion, a band hailing from Brazil. So, black metal recording practices are legendary, and they are deliberately antagonistic towards the mainstream production values. So we're going to be talking about black metal in the woods, myth and practice. I will say a lot of it is myth. What you hear about in the media about black metal, most of it is just, it's blown up, especially when that major motion picture about the history of Mayhem came out. Even the band Mayhem thought it was ridiculous. But I think there is some cool mythos and some cool legends and, I don't know, stories about black metal recordings, and we're going to talk about those. So first, recording practices. So one of my favorite bands in terms of the, I don't know, original old school black metal goes, Dark Throne from Norway. They intentionally lowered their guitar treble and buried the drums to create this, what they call necro sound. So the early albums, like A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Under a Funeral Moon, are sometimes rumored to have had outdoor recording components, but interviews with the band confirm that this is not true. They were recorded at creative studios in Norway, but the recording style is, you know, what we consider that traditional black metal sound. Another one is the Les Legions Noir. This was a group of black metal artists in France. They used old school tape decks and bedroom recorders, sometimes without microphones. They were a very underground French black metal collective. They were mostly active in the mid-1990s, and you can still find their music floating around online, though it may be very hard to find physical copies of this work. So bands like Mutilation, I'm going to mess this band's name up because every single letter has like an umlaut or some sort of accent on it. So Akon Katra, bands like that fall under this Les Legion Noir umbrella. So their releases are mostly demos, splits, very limited production runs. They are very lo-fi in production. I think it just puts a strong emphasis on the raw atmosphere and the darkness. So it may have been intentional to record that way, or maybe it was the only way they could record. Who knows, right? Unless you were able to track them down and ask them. Some of their better documented releases have known recording locations or studios. So Hell Satanas, We Are the Black Legions by the band Mutilation is credited as being recorded at Black Legion Studio. Vampires of Black Imperial Blood by Mutilation also notes its recording location as Black Legion's studio. Though I will say you can call anything a studio. For example, my band Abyssal Rights recorded our first demo in a storage unit, and I'm going to get into that in much more detail later. We just called the recording studio Plague Altar. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. We recorded it in a storage unit, right? So you can call anything literally a studio, but that doesn't really mean it's a professional studio. Some more lore. Fenris of Dark Throne said the coldness of their album Transylvanian Hunger was shaped by recording in a freezing studio with broken heating. Now, I doubt that really had any real effect on the sound quality of the music, but maybe it put them in a specific mood or a vibe or an atmosphere to make that album sound the way it did. Les Legion Noir tapes were distributed only in tiny numbers, sometimes fewer than 20 copies. So that makes them very scarce, and it's part of their what we might consider their cultural capital. So this is a classic non-activist alternative media practice. These recordings weren't political manifestos by any means, but we might consider them cultural resistance. By sounding wrong, they communicated authenticity to insiders, so the people who they consider their in-group, so the people their music is serving, the fans of this underground black metal scene, not the people who are listening to pop music on the radio. So you know the drill. It's time for some more music. Let's listen to Island Outlook Avenue by the band Slash Ketchum out of Brisbane, Australia. That was Slash Ketchum with the track Island Outlook Avenue. It's not very often you find an extreme metal band with a Pokemon reference in their name. I'm assuming that's supposed to be a Pokemon reference, Ash Ketchum, Slash Ketchum. I just think that's super interesting. Really cool post-black metal. Go support the artist. So we're going to talk about punk and hardcore right now. So punk and hardcore is also another, community of music that has just as much mythos and lore and ethos about DIY as black metal does. So if anything, black metal mythologized coldness, punk and hardcore mythologized speed and urgency. So some of the recording practices that I want to make note of: one-night sessions. So many hardcore EPs were recorded live in a studio just in a couple hours. One example of this is Inner Ear Studios, ran by Don Zientara. So Don Zientara is an American record producer and musician. He owns Inner Ear Studios in Arlington, Virginia, located just outside of Washington, D.C., and is most widely known for his production work with Fugazi, Minor Threat, and various other Discord record artists. So he's very huge in that DC punk scene back in the 80s and 90s. So Minor Threat, Bad Brains, and others recorded in this suburban basement. We started seeing dual cassette decks, so countless bands used a deck-to-deck overdub, each bounce degrading fidelity but adding grit to the audio quality. I think there's some interesting lore here. So, for example, Crass, the UK punk band, I featured them in my last episode. They recorded at Dial House, which was not just a studio. The house itself was a manifesto. They were recording, producing, and distributing everything themselves, embodying this DIY politics. Not only that, but Dial House was a punk squat house, so they were living there too. So Dial House was a very multifaceted experience for these people. Black Flag, the hardcore band out of the 80s in the United States, they recorded their Nervous Breakdown EP, and it was cut in a single night. They didn't fix very many of the mistakes. They probably intentionally left them in. So there's stories that circulate about punk and hardcore vocalists using whatever they could find to record. There's even tales of singers screaming through vacuum cleaner hoses as makeshift microphones. Whether that literally happened or not almost doesn't matter. What's important is how these stories reinforce the underground's ethos, creativity, resourcefulness, and a rejection of professionalism. I am almost tempted myself to try recording with a microphone hose. I just want to hear what that sounds like and if it's even possible. I couldn't find a specific example of a band doing that, but it was rumored that bands were doing that, and rumors have to start somewhere, right? So I want to find out more. So I don't know, maybe shoot me an email if you ever record a song with a microphone hose. So the very well-known, punk shock rocker G.G. Allin was notorious for using broken microphones, or not even a mic at all, with vocals bleeding through any room microphone. And it's no surprise that he was using broken equipment. He would literally bash microphones on his head until he would bleed. So whether the bashing of the microphone or the bleeding into it, that was probably why he was using broken equipment. If you remember the band Ween, their early tapes in the late 80s leaned heavily on strange lo-fi vocal processing, including toy mics and household objects. So you can see there's this theme of just ingenuity, creativeness, whether they're intentionally picking these objects because they think it's going to create a cool effect, or they're doing it because they have nothing else at their disposal. I think it's important to note this, and it just creates such a unique listening experience that we should be documenting. We should be noting these things. And who knows, maybe we should be passing on these techniques, even though we do have fancy music studios. Maybe recreating some of this stuff could be a way to continue to tell that story. So this ties back to alternative media in terms of participation. Punk's ethos was this: anyone can do it. The degraded sound wasn't a flaw. It was proof of independence from professional doxa. So let's check out some more music together. This band is called Gene, coming from the good old UK. This track is titled 1 Million Dead. Enjoy. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed the chaos that is Gene, and I hope you were not one of the 1 million dead. So there's other genres and oddities that have been influenced by DIY ethos, especially when we're talking about recording. DIY ethos has shaped things like grindcore, sludge, noise, and lo-fi indie. So let's talk about a couple of those examples. For example, grindcore and death metal. Napalm Death is a legendary grindcore band. I wouldn't say they're grind, today's standards, but early on in their career, they were a grindcore band. Now they're more along the lines of death metal. But their early demos were cramped in rehearsal rooms on overdriven 4-track like cassette players. They would, record chaotic, loud, noisy music and with very little microphones and tape decks. Some bands even recorded in bathrooms or storage units to get that natural reverb, or maybe they just didn't even have a place to call their own to get that recording done. So my band Abyssal Rites took this route when we recorded our first demo that was titled Synesthesia Ritual. Our practice space at the time was a storage unit in the great city of Tulsa. So when we recorded this demo, we used a free recording software called Audacity and an inbox with only 2 microphone ports. At the time, I worked with our bass player at that time. His name was Brian Irwin, and we did our best to mix and master this demo, to move the microphones around, to try to capture the drumming, and to, direct input the guitar and bass and all that. So it definitely wasn't the best sounding demo when you objectively, when you think about sound quality. But we did capture that vibe, that quote unquote vibe that black metal bands hope to capture in that sound, that rawness, that ethereal underground sound that black metal bands hope to achieve. In terms of sludge and doom metal, I Hate God embraced distorted amps and broken microphones to create a sonic metaphor. Some bands would put amplifiers inside of trash cans, especially metal ones, to emphasize decay. For those of you who like noise and experimental music, the legendary Merzbow treated tape decks as instruments instead of just a recording device. They would re-record layers of noise until the medium itself broke down. And there's an art equivalent to this. So, for example, people will photocopy something over and over and over again until the image breaks down and becomes something completely new. This is kind of like the audio version of that. In terms of indie and lo-fi rock, a band called the Mountain Goats recorded albums on a Panasonic boombox. So car sounds and clipping became part of John Darnielle's storytelling. Sebadoh and early Beck embraced 4-track fuzz as a rejection of the glossy 90s alt-rock at the time. So how does this tie into my own research? This is a vernacular creativity. So ordinary people are adapting tools not meant for professional use. So using those tape decks, using the vacuum cleaner nozzle as a microphone, all of those things are not meant for professional use. DIY recording becomes this cultural preservation and a form of alternative media itself. So without these, without access to these styles, maybe these demos would never exist. Maybe these sound recordings would never exist. And with that, we've come to another music break. This time we're going to check out some Russian black metal. This is Illa with the song Embrace. All right, welcome back to the stream. That was Illa with the song Embrace, and I hope you enjoyed it. So DIY recordings force us to rethink what quote-unquote good sound even means. So I would challenge you to think about how we define what good is in terms of audio recordings. Does it just mean that everything is easily heard? Does it mean that we're shooting for some sort of vibe or aesthetic? What does good mean in terms of sound recording? And maybe someday I'll have a recording artist come in and we can talk about that. But today it's just me. So we're going to talk about aesthetics, authenticity, and resistance. So what is authenticity through imperfection? So in terms of punk, out-of-tune guitars and clipped vocals prove this idea of realness. Black metal, things like hiss and distortion as a ritual mask. Grindcore, chaos as intensity. So it's this resistance to mainstream doxa, where mainstream equals polished, underground equals authenticity. Oftentimes we think of overproduced music as selling out. So for example, Metallica, probably the most well-known metal band in the history of metal music. In the early days, they were raw thrash metal, right? As they begin to grow as musicians, make more money, their albums become, more and more produced, more clean. A lot of their, earlier fans consider them to be selling out because of this overproduction. You know what? I don't know where I stand on that issue. I don't think having nicely produced music takes away from it, but some music does sound better with these underground aesthetics. There is some lore around this. So for example, Fenriz, he's one of the gentlemen behind Darkthrone. I mentioned Darkthrone earlier. Darkthrone is a two-piece band. So Fenriz mocked overproduced metal as being plastic instead of metal. Punk fans treasured degraded cassette copies for their aura of authenticity. So you overplay it, eventually it becomes degraded, and that's kind of like a badge of honor. So how do we connect this alternative media research to this idea of DIY recording? So I like to think about DIY recordings as media artifacts. So these are ways of telling stories outside of the mainstream channels. So you see this alternative media in action. Demos are not just music. They said, we exist, we resist. Sometimes it wasn't about resisting. I mentioned this earlier. Sometimes it was just, I am poor and I can't afford to go to the nice fancy studio. So we're going to do what we can with what we have. But at the end of the day, these demos prove that we exist. Non-activist projects like blogs or review websites are preserving this culture in the same way. And I mentioned that in episode 1, for example, Angry Metal Guy, Nat Skogg's blog, to a lesser extent, Pitchfork and other, the Encyclopedia Metallum or, the Metal Archives are ways that these things are being preserved. Without tapes and recordings from this era, entire scenes could vanish. Maybe there is a genre of music that only existed in this small niche culture that if we didn't have that, that recording, we wouldn't even know that it happened. Today, many survive only through tape trading, online uploading, and blogs. I remember Blogspot being a huge thing in the early 2000s when I was looking for, more music to digest and share with my friends. I would look for those free uploads of music on Blogspot and find out about all types of underground bands. There's a vernacular creativity here. DIY shows everyday ingenuity with tools not designed for professional use. I think it's super creative how these bands recorded their music. I would have never have thought to use a vacuum cleaner tube as a microphone, for example. I would have never thought. I remember watching the Joy Division movie they made. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. Where in one of the songs, they were using spray bottles, like aerosol cans, to get that sound in the introduction of a song. Using these lo-fi everyday tools to create a new sound, I think is rather interesting. So lo-fi recordings signal belonging. Fans learn to read imperfection as authenticity rather than being lo-fi to be lo-fi. So let's wrap this up. DIY recording is more than just cheap equipment. It often rejects mainstream values, preserves underground culture, and creates authenticity through imperfection. So, for example, punk used urgency and speed. Black metal created ritual atmosphere. Grindcore and noise used chaos. Indie and lo-fi bands focused on intimacy. In the next episode, I will be diving into the world of the spooky. So I'm going to be doing the 31 for 31 challenge. I was inspired to do this challenge because I'm a huge Last Podcast on the Left fan. So the 31 for 31 challenge is where you watch a horror or spooky movie every single day in October. So that's at the bare minimum 31 movies. I'm going to have weekly updates covering my 31 for 31 challenge, where I'll be watching a horror movie every single day in October and discussing how I feel about the movie, whether it's, giving it a review, talking about its background. I will also have a co-host for my 31 for 31 challenge. My colleague, Stephen Dowdy, will be joining me on this adventure, and I look forward to having his thoughts and jokes and humor as a part of the podcast for the month of October. Thanks for listening to another episode of Matt Talks Media. Make sure you're subscribing. You can find me on all the regular social media platforms and on Spotify. Share it with your friends and keep exploring the underground with me. Thank you.